Welcome, brave souls, to the chilling depths of horror and detail, the realm where the shadows whisper ancient secrets and nightmares come to life. I am your guide through the darkness, and on this channel, we delve into the spine-chilling world of Wendigo horror stories that will send shivers down your spine. First story. My girlfriend took me camping. I just want to start by saying that dating is hard. Once you get past all the bots, ads, and scammers and meet a real person, the guessing game begins. Why is this person actually available right now? Are they really just down on their luck? Or is it something else that you're happier not knowing? Then, once you figure out their deep dark secrets, the question becomes, are they willing to put up with your deep dark secrets? This process can take weeks to sort out, usually resulting in a dead end somewhere, forcing you to start over. The whole thing is frustrating, demeaning, and humiliating enough that you're physically and emotionally exhausted, making you just want to give up and be a loner. Now I know what you're wondering. What's this got to do with anything? Well, it's kinda simple. A little bit ago, I wrote about how my girlfriend, Wendy, never eats and that I heard some unsettling things at her house the last time I visited. Well, I decided to keep seeing Wendy. Sure, she might have some unusual habits, but she makes me feel good about myself, and I'm happy with her. So what if she never eats or chases off bears while nude in the middle of the night? Compared to returning to the dating scene, that's really not so bad. We even have nicknames for each other now, Country Girl and City Boy. I'll let you guess which is which. Anyway, that's a rather long and roundabout way of saying that. Yeah, I went on that camping trip with her, and things didn't go quite how I expected. First off, I want to say that she was right. The forest really is beautiful. The sun's heat, combined with the coolness of the shade, while listening to the insects drone lazily in the background, seems to slow time to a crawl, making each breath a relaxing experience in and of itself. It's entirely unlike anything you'll experience during your morning commute. Combine all that with the right company, and soon you'll wonder why you'd ever return. And let me tell you, Wendy is 100% the right company. Wendy was quick with tips to make the hike easier, from how to properly distribute your pack load to how to lace your shoes for maximum comfort. During the trek to where we were going to set up camp, she alternated between offering interesting bits of information about the local flora and fauna and walking in silence, allowing me to get lost in the experience. The whole affair made me want to give up the city life and move to the country. There was just one thing during the walk that wasn't as pleasant as everything else. At one point, we must have walked too close to a skunk or a rotting carcass or something because the whole area around us started to reek. At first, it wasn't so bad, but eventually, it got so strong it made me want to gag. I jokingly mentioned it to Wendy, but she just looked ahead like she was determined and told me, "Pick up the pace. We'll be past it soon enough." Sure enough, we eventually got past the smell, and things quickly became pleasant again. The rest of the hike passed without incident, and Wendy even helped me set up the tent. Her evident experience in the matter showed through because it took no time. Soon enough, everything was ready, and we even had a nice, cheerful fire roaring. This time, when she pulled out the supplies for dinner, it didn't even bat an eye when it was clearly only enough for one. Whatever was going on with her, this was just the way it was going to be. It was up to me to accept that or move on, and I'd made my call. But I have to say, for someone who never seems to eat, she sure knows how to sear a steak to perfection. After a pleasant evening and an even more pleasant night, we passed out in the tent together while listening to the crickets and the more distant owls. But of course, if that's all that happened, I wouldn't be writing about it here. Sometime during the night, I awoke to find I was alone in the tent. This wasn't too unexpected because Wendy was both an outdoor enthusiast and a bit of a night owl. I debated calling out to her, but something in the air felt like I shouldn't disturb it with such an out-of-place sound. However, Mother Nature did have her demands, and it was time to answer her call. As I unzipped the tent and stepped out, I couldn't help but look up into the night sky. The stars were breathtaking. You never see this many this vibrant in the city. However, their beauty couldn't distract me for long in the face of more urgent demands. Do you know that feeling when you've been holding it in a little too long and finally experience relief? If it weren't for my experiences earlier that night, I might be tempted to claim it is better than sex, but we'll just say it was still pretty euphoric. Maybe it distracted me from the fact that all the usual night sounds had suddenly gone quiet, but it couldn't distract me from the sudden smell of rotting flesh. It was even stronger than it had been on the trail and was accompanied by the kind of fear that you usually feel when you're very young and just starting to wonder if there might be reasons sounds go bump in the night. I gagged as I struggled to cut off the stream, zip up my pants, and retreat into the tent again. Once in the tent, I reached for the flashlight, then hesitated. I desperately wanted to see better, but something in the back of my mind told me it was better to remain hidden. Of course, I don't know how well hidden a blue tent in the middle of the forest can be, but turning on a flashlight would be like activating a beacon for everything within a few miles to see. I sat in the dark for I don't know how long, feeling my heart pound through my chest loud enough that I was sure whatever was out there could hear it clearly. Thankfully, the smell eventually faded, but I was still so high on adrenaline that I knew I wouldn't sleep another wink for the rest of the night. Or so I thought. The following day, I awoke with Wendy cuddled in my arm, with one of her legs and arms draped over me, and once again, she was totally nude. Now, I was pretty sure she'd put on some pajamas before going to bed, but as she stirred and I got a good look at what was on display, I suddenly didn't care all that much. Eventually, she smiled lazily up at me and spoke. "You sleep all right, city boy? You seem to have some pretty rough dreams in the middle of the night." At the time, those words made perfect sense. In the light of day, it seemed pretty clear that whatever happened last night was probably just a vivid dream brought on by the experiences of the day before and an unfamiliar environment. After a bit more time together, we decided to get up and tackle another day in the forest. However, when I finally crawled out of the tent, I could see our entire camp was in disarray. It was like something had gone through and tossed everything around. A few of the more delicate items were totally demolished. After a moment, I called out, Hey, you might want to take a look at this." As Wendy crawled out of the tent, she made a face. Must have been a bear. They usually don't come out this way, so I wasn't too worried about them. "I guess that's on me, sorry." A bear, that kind of made sense. At least, I told myself so. As we were cleaning up, I even saw tracks, though, in my inexperience as a city boy, I would have said they belonged to a dog, not a bear. A huge dog. Maybe a wolf? What was even odder was when I found what looked like hoof prints. Looking at the prints, I realized that deer must be much bigger than they look on TV since they were more than twice as long as my hand. There isn't much more to say about the day. We fixed the place up, had breakfast, went on a hike, made dinner, and called it a night, with a few other minor activities sprinkled throughout. I was back to enjoying the trip, so much so that I had mostly forgotten about the night before. But that night is when things took a bit of an unexpected turn. Once again, I awoke in the middle of the night. Thankfully, I wasn't alone this time, as Wendy was still asleep, half on top of me again. However, that stench was back and stronger than ever. It was amazing how bright it seemed in the tent. It must have been a full moon, or at least nearly full, because I could clearly see the shadow of a large deer pass between us and the night sky. But there was something wrong with this deer. It was clearly too tall, as if it was standing on hind legs, and when it opened its mouth, I could even make out a mouthful of very sharp teeth. I couldn't help it. I felt myself breathing more heavily by the second as my heart rate skyrocketed. My mind went blank when I suddenly felt Wendy stir. Remembering the presence of my considerably smaller girlfriend, I suddenly felt protective, as if I couldn't let anything happen to her. I was just about to tell her to be quiet when I noticed her looking up at me with a finger on her lips, as if telling me to do the same. Then she whispered to me, "Stay in the tent," and started to get up. I don't know what I was thinking or if I was thinking. All I knew was I couldn't let Wendy go out to face whatever that was. So I reached out and grabbed her wrist before she could exit the tent. However, when she looked back at me, I released her immediately, almost as scared of her as whatever was outside the tent. Her eyes reflected light back at me like a cat's, and I could see the nails on her hand growing as I watched. In half a moment, she turned back around, opened the tent, and climbed outside. I will never forget the sound I heard at that moment. After I got home, I looked up the calls of a bunch of wild animals, and in hindsight, I'd say it was like a compilation of an elk call, a rabbit scream, and a mountain lion scream, but impossibly loud. Wendy shouted in answer, her tiny human voice sounding so frail in comparison. At least it did until it started to change, morphing and twisting into the howl of an impossibly large wolf. I couldn't help it. I peeked out the tent flap, and standing in front of the tent was what I could only describe as a werewolf. The little 5 foot and change Wendy was now standing at least 7 feet tall, covered in fur with claws and fangs that looked like they could tear through steel, and she looked ready for murder. Then, some movement on the opposite end of our camp drew my attention, and I witnessed a living nightmare that suddenly made a werewolf seem like less of a problem. It looked kind of like a deer if a deer had more articulated limbs far too long for its body. The feet ended in hooves, but the hands ended in long bony claws. The whole thing looked desiccated, its skin drawn so tight over its ribs and arms you could make out the skeleton beneath. The fur was spotty and looked partially rotted, with open holes leaking bodily fluids that should never see light. Its teeth were long and serrated, clearly meant for tearing rather than chewing. I sometimes hear hunters talking about deer being 8 or 10 points, but if I had to estimate, this thing had a 30-point antler, with many of the tines covered in what I suspected to be dried viscera from previous victims. The two monsters charged each other. The nightmare, which I now know was a Wendigo, lowered its head, intending to impale its opponent, but at the last second, Wendy threw herself nearly flat on the ground, only to rocket up into the Wendigo, latching onto its long neck with her powerful jaws while her hind feet kicked gouges into its vulnerable stomach. However, the Wendigo didn't seem willing to give up that easily and tossed Wendy aside. She hit the ground hard and was soon set upon by the other monster. She raised an arm to defend herself, only for the Wendigo to latch on with its own teeth, easily tearing through her skin and muscles. With a powerful kick, Wendy pushed the nightmare back, then started swiping at him over and over, making it lose ground. However, lowering its head, the Wendigo charged forward again, and this time, Wendy wasn't fast enough as the Wendigo caught her on his antlers and flipped her over his back, with new blood darkening the tips of the tines. But that was its downfall as Wendy sprung up and again latched onto its neck with her teeth, this time from behind. The nightmare struggled in vain, occasionally raking Wendy with his claws, but she refused to let go and began ripping and tearing her way through its neck until she grabbed hold of its antlers, and with one final jerk, the head came free. I don't have the heart to describe what came next, But let's just say the sound of flesh being torn and eaten is much more distinct through the thin membrane of a tent than a closed cabin window. Time passed. At least an hour, maybe 2 or 3. It's hard to say for sure. I don't know what I expected to happen next. Maybe I was going to be next, or perhaps I'd wake up from this nightmare, but eventually the adrenaline passed. My eyes grew heavy, and I fell asleep again. When I awoke in the morning, I was alone this time. There was no sign Wendy had come back. I'd half hoped she'd still be here, telling me I'd had another nightmare, but I don't think I would have believed it again. It was kind of sad and lonely packing up our things by myself. I debated bringing Wendy's stuff with me, but I'm not that good of a hiker and wasn't confident I could pull it off. So I just left her things in her pack inside the tent. When I exited the tent, I was more than a little surprised to see Wendy sitting calmly by the fire pit with no wounds in sight. She smiled sadly. "So, I guess I owe you an explanation." I remember hesitating, my mind blank, before I settled on the thought I had earlier. "What? You're not going to try and convince me it was a nightmare again?" She looked around at all the destruction in the campsite. Earth was kicked up, trees had claw marks gouged out, and there were signs of blood splatter everywhere. "I didn't think I could convince you this time." I nodded as I looked around. "Yeah, I guess not." Then, I looked back at her. "You know, for a bit there, I was starting to think you were the monster eating people out here." Wendy pointed at herself, then laughed. "Wait, me? Wendy the Wendigo? Don't you think that's a little too on the nose?" I couldn't help it. As weird and messed up as everything was, as disturbing as everything I learned was, this was the Wendy I knew and cared for. So, I laughed with her. "Yeah, maybe so. Long story short, we're still together. Sure, my girlfriend might be a 7-foot-tall monster that eats other monsters for fun, but everyone has their quirks. Besides, dating is hard, and I'm happy where I am." Second story. Wendigo stories. When I was young, I often spent parts of summers with my grandmother in her home out in the country. It was my favorite place in the world, and I always looked forward to the week-long stays of gardening, baking, late-night fires with s'mores and ghost stories, and enjoying having my grandmother all to myself. There was a pond, not far from her house, where I would sometimes go to swim. It was home to quite a few frogs, and at night they made the most incessant noises. I complained to my grandmother only once, saying I couldn't enjoy the night breeze with all that racket. She took me on her lap and told me a story about an old man and woman who lived near a lake. The old man couldn't stand the singing of the frogs, but his wife told him that they kept the Wendigo away, and to harm them would be unwise. Well, he didn't listen, and set about methodically catching all the frogs on the lake. It was a process that took some time, but he did not stop until he had rid the lake of the pesky amphibians. That night, without the protection of the frogs, he and his wife were slaughtered by the Wendigo, a vicious, whip-like demon creature with elongated fingers ending in razor-sharp talons, and rows of silver teeth as thin and keen as needles. I wrote it off as another of her ghost stories, though she seemed more serious than usual about it. I never complained about the frogs again, mostly because I grew to enjoy them and put the story out of my mind. In fact, I'd forgotten all about it until it came up this past spring in a Native American literature class I was taking in college. The mention of the Wendigo sparked that old memory of my grandmother's story. I thought she had made up the word. I didn't realize there were stories about it, originating in Algonquian legends. Eager to connect something from my childhood to the topic, I Googled it, only to find that my grandmother had apparently been mistaken. There was nothing I could find about the story she had told me, nor any references of frogs providing protection from the Wendigo. In fact, the The Wendigo of legends seemed very little like my grandmother's version. They were said to be insatiable, craving human flesh, and sometimes created from the forms of people who had resorted to cannibalism to survive. Descriptions varied, but they sounded almost nothing like my grandmother's bogeyman version. I actually chucked as I read it, almost a bit embarrassed by how badly my grandmother had messed up the original tale. I changed residences this summer, moving to a newly built, 1,000 square foot, on each side, duplex on the edge of town. The other side is to be occupied by my landlady, who'd had the place built. However, she isn't scheduled to move the rest of her stuff in and begin living there for a couple of weeks. She's waiting for her lease to end. Even though my new place is only a few minutes from the edge of town, it feels much more isolated. I enjoy the seclusion of my new home and its proximity to a more natural setting. I'm surrounded by woods, and from my patio, I can even see a pond beyond the carefully landscaped lawn, which is meticulously carved out from the surrounding woodlands. Just like the pond near my grandmother's house, the frogs have put up a ferocious racket lately. I prefer not to pay to run my air conditioning if I can help it, so I have every window open to catch a breeze. That means that I can hear them as clearly as if I were standing on the water's edge. It took a few days to get used to the noise, but I'm fine now, just like I was those summers when I was young. In fact, the noise has been comforting to me during the stress of the move. Tonight is different. I find myself standing in my living room, staring at where the pond is, though I can't see it in the dark. The air is eerily still and oppressively warm, but all my windows are shut, and I feel impossibly cold. I'd long since convinced myself that my grandmother's story had been a silly tale, a twisting of an old legend by irreverent storytellers. But for some reason, I have the most overwhelming sense of dread growing in the pit of my stomach. I don't know what to do. I'm trapped. Leaving my house means braving the darkness beyond my home, but I don't know if I'm going to be safe in here either. The frogs have stopped singing. Third story. My girlfriend's journals. I am Wendigo. I was staying at the home of two of my friends, Reagan and Jim. Reagan and Jim went missing, along with my girlfriend Victoria. I had no idea where any of them were, and my only contact with them for the following week was a few creepy texts sent from my girlfriend. I knew they were kidnapped. I knew they must have been going through hell. The person that did this to me let me know very clearly that if I tried to contact authorities, they would be dead. They were not playing games. The note I found with a severed finger attached to it was proof of that. Seriously, if you're lost right now, go read the whole story and stop being a lazy prick. So here we are, a week after the disappearance of my friends, and a few weeks after the disappearance of Victoria. I had more or less given up on life. I quit my job and was living off of my savings in a house that was not mine. It wasn't hard, even with only a few $1,000s to my name. Reagan and Jim had a ton of stuff I could use. The best part is that I didn't need to pay rent. I would spend my days playing video games and browsing Reddit, and I would spend my nights drinking heavily and fantasizing about ways that I could rescue the people I loved. It wasn't until 2 weeks later that I finally got hit with reality. It was midnight and I was buzzed and watching a terrible movie on TV. I heard a car pull up outside on the driveway. I thought nothing of it. I kept watching that terrible movie. Then I heard a muffled scream. Shit. I remembered that I had a psychopath stalking me. I got up slowly, trying to use my ears to figure out what was going on outside. I heard footsteps. Someone heavy. Another muffled scream and a grunt. Then a few seconds of silence. Finally, a knock on the door that made me figuratively shit my pants. I just stood there like an idiot, waiting for something to happen. A minute or two went by, and then I heard the car speed off. I didn't know what to do, so I checked outside the window. Nothing. I looked into the peephole in the door and saw nobody. By this time, I had gotten over the harassment from this psychopath. Judging from how easily he or she abducted Victoria and my friends, they could kill me anytime they wanted to. I was still alive. And because I was still alive, it was time for more drinking, more shitty movies, and more sleep. I don't know what time I knocked out, but I woke up in the morning with a splitting headache. I drank some water and made some breakfast. I remembered the previous night's events, and now that it was light out, I decided to check the driveway to see what happened. I didn't have to walk to the driveway to find out. I opened the door and saw her. Reagan, bloodied, naked, and pretty much dead. I dragged her inside and put her on the couch. If I had opened the door last night, her condition wouldn't have been this bad. I could have done something. I got her water and tried to wake her up. She did. At first, she had no idea where she was. I tried talking to her, but she was really out of it. She smelled really bad, too. Like urine and feces. I was pretty sure she was covered in it, too, along with blood. There were cuts up and down her legs, groin, and armpits. I just sat there and waited. I had a few drinks and watched a few terrible movies. In the evening, she finally came to. She asked me what happened. "You tell me," I said. "You got dumped on the front door last night like this. What is going on? Where is Jim?" She talked slowly. She was still exhausted, and rightfully so. "I don't remember much, not yet. You're an asshole, Alex." "What?" I asked. Why? Why? Why am I still naked? Why the hell did you leave me out there all night? Why didn't you call the cops, or take me to a hospital? Do you need a hospital? No, asshole. I'll be fine. I need a shower, and I need to call the police. You can't call the police, I told her. I already did. They couldn't do much because I had no clue what to tell them. I also got a note with a finger on it that said if I contact the cops, then you, Jim, and Victoria die. A what? A finger? Yeah, look. I am as confused as you are. I have no idea what's going on, and I'm done trying to figure it out. When you're ready, tell me what happened. If you need anything, let me know. I stood up and was about to walk out when she turned on her side and I saw her back. Holy shit, Reagan, what the? Words. I saw words. Carved into her. I read them out loud to her. Used up filth. She began shaking. She ran to the bathroom to look. I heard screaming. I heard crying. I went in and she was on the floor sobbing. What the hell happened to you? I asked her. He assaulted me. He? Who's he? I don't know. He tortured Jim. The things he did to him were so much worse. We have to go back. I remember how to get back. I remember where he took us. You're in no condition to do shit right now, I told her. Help me get into the tub, I can barely move. I'm covered in my own piss, and you're hovering above me like a douchebag. I helped her up and carried her to the tub. Run the water, she told me, so I did. I was about to leave when she asked me where I was going. To give you some privacy, I said. I don't want privacy, I want to kill the piece of shit that did this. Sit down and listen. I know where he's holding them. Who's he? He only spoke to us once. The only thing I ever heard him say. I am Wendigo. I need flesh. So we sat there for the next hour as she told me everything that happened to her in the last week. Guys, I thought I could fit this all into one last update, but there is more to tell. Rather than telling you Reagan's story as I remember it, I'm having her type it up for you guys, and I will post it when it's done and when she is ready for the world to read it. It gets pretty damn gruesome. For the few of you who are confused about the timeline of events here, this all took place months ago. We've all been recovering since then, and I have been trying to piece together this story in a comprehensible format for you. I'll see you guys again soon. For now, for the love of God, keep your doors locked. Fourth story, Wendigo encounter. We were camping up in the northernmost area of Washington. My girlfriend is incredibly superstitious, so she insisted we brought weapons. So I had my combat knife and a 12-gauge shotgun, and she brought a .22 rifle alongside a newly sharpened machete. Our son was just 3 years old at the time. She and I were set on edge from a park ranger, who seemed very tense and uneasy, who stopped us and instead of confiscating our weapons told us to be careful and stay safe, then sent us along our way to the camp. When we got there, we were informed that several visitors had spoken about some unnatural noises and a pale creature that would mimic voices and sounds of people who weren't talking or seeming to be distracted. I laughed and put the idea out my mind, thinking to myself there's no way. They're with us. But I knew better. So we then reached the area we were going to set up camp. We immediately got a fire ready to light and set up our tent and bags. I fed my son as my girlfriend ate a snack. We decided to get a lay of the area, so me and my girlfriend hiked around for about an hour or so. I had one of those baby-carrying backpacks, and my son started to get real heavy. Everything seemed normal until I saw something down the almost path we were on. We walked closer to investigate and saw drag marks. It looked as if someone had killed a buck. There was a whole outline in the dirt with a small dried pool of blood, as if someone grabbed it from the antlers and pulled. That wouldn't be possible for any man to do. The buck, or whatever it was, would have been way too big for that. Shaken, we rushed back to base camp and restarted the fire and hurried back into our tent. Too afraid to leave since it was dusk by now, we stayed inside the tent and my girlfriend put our son to bed. Eventually, probably from the exhaustion of fright, we fell asleep. What must have been hours later, I awoke to a faint rasping sound that sounded like a child crying. I gazed outside in confusion and saw the outline of a creature that seemed to be a buck, standing over something. It seemed to be about 20 feet away, but at a closer glance had unnaturally long limbs for a buck and was eerily tall. In sudden fear, I unloaded 2 shots into the creature and heard a loud blood-curdling my girlfriend awoke, screaming to the shots I had fired as I tried to explain what I had heard. To my surprise, the animal hadn't moved an inch. Then I noticed the stains on the side of the animal. It looked like blood was running down the edge, and lots of it. It stared at me deep into my eyes as I became petrified with fear. A sinister feeling of dread fell over me as if it knew I couldn't move. I thought to myself, what if it starts to bolt towards us? Just then, this tall, decrepit demonic thing seemed to whisper something. I couldn't exactly tell what it was saying, but it seemed to have said, "I need more children." My girlfriend screamed, asking where our son was. We blacked out. In the morning, we awoke to park rangers at our campsite. We didn't see our son anywhere. We told the rangers that he was missing, and they started a search party. I explained what had happened, and strangely, they seemed to believe it. The one who seemed to be older by at least a decade pulled along the one we met earlier and whispered in his ear. I only heard a single line, and I'm not even sure if what I heard was correct. It sounded like he said, "It's getting bolder." They didn't seem to want us by ourselves, so they waited with us while they continued the search. We stayed in a log cabin for 3 days with a forest ranger, when suddenly some rangers came into the cabin saying they couldn't find our son. My girlfriend starts to sob. I start to hate myself, thinking that I could have done something if I wasn't frozen in fear. We rushed outside only to find some injured and frightened police officials. The rangers wouldn't tell us anything of what happened or what they saw, or why the cops were scared shitless. All we know is that we don't have a son anymore. God help whoever goes into that forest next, and please, please don't bring your kids with you. Fifth story. Our ancestors were right to fear the forest. I read once that in antiquity, People were advised to avoid the forests and wilds. These territories were treacherous and often unexplored or unmarked. Those who would enter would not always return, and so myths began to spread that terrible things lurked within these lands. Most people were content with letting the untamed lands remain so. As time went on, though, most of the world moved on to fearing other things. I, however, have come to fear the woods much like our ancestors did. My family moved to the small wooded town of Sunderland, Vermont when I was 8. My parents wanted someplace quiet and not so crowded, something in contrast to a place like Boston. I didn't particularly want to move, but I hated Boston anyways, so I didn't argue. The place my parents bought was a rustic 2-story with a backyard that rested against the western edge of a forest. For the first 7 years I lived in Sunderland, things were normal. The woods and I had a healthy relationship. I'd hang out within viewing range of the house, and I would never go in after dark. That changed when I was a junior in high school. That's when my nightmare began. It was a late summer afternoon, and the sky was a dull gray. My friend Chris and I went into the woods behind my house to smoke a joint he bought off a kid in our calculus class for $30. It was a fatty, but Chris definitely got ripped off. We don't need to go far. I just don't want my parents to be able to see us, I told Chris. You've never explored deeper than this? He asked. A couple times with my mom and dad, but I've never really been interested otherwise. Then it's time for you to go on an adventure, he said, and I've got the perfect solution to your fear of getting lost. Chris stopped and dropped his backpack at his feet. He rummaged around for a moment and pulled out a can of red spray paint. We can make a ring on the trees we pass so we don't get lost. Why are you even carrying that around? I asked. Never know when you might want to mark your territory. You're an idiot, dude, I laughed. We continued walking deeper into the forest, Chris marking the way. I let him walk ahead of me as we walked further on ground made soft by years of decay. After a few minutes, he slowed down abruptly before hurrying over to something and saying, "Hey Heather, come take a look at this." "What's up?" I asked as I approached his side. "Check this hole out." Just a few feet in front of Chris was a pit. It was probably 3 to 4 meters in diameter. It looked like someone had used a giant post-hole digger to lift a perfect cylinder out of the forest floor. Rope-like vines hung around the edges, but the walls of the hole were strangely smooth. "How deep do you think it is?" I heard Chris light the joint. "Good enough spot," he mumbled to himself. "No idea. Let's throw some stuff in it." I kicked a rock in and waited to hear it collide with something, but there was only silence. Chris threw in a couple branches as I stood close to the edge, watching them fall into the black. Silence again. Freaky. Chris exhaled smoke and passed me the joint. "Thanks," I said as I took a deep hit and peered into the pit. It was almost mesmerizing, though the longer I stared, the more nervous I felt. I felt as if something beyond the darkness was staring back at me. I took another hit and passed the joint. "I don't like this hole," I said. "My head hurts looking into it." We continued to hand the joint back and forth as we stared into the pit. "What do you think's down there?" Chris asked. "Probably dirt and lots of bugs." "I hate bugs." Chris kicked a bunch of dirt into the hole. "I dunno. They can be kinda cool, 'cept spiders." "Yes, spiders. Also, this pit." "Let's go home," Chris said as he tossed the still smoking roach into the pit. We watched the light get swallowed by the darkness that filled the hole. "Man, that's deep," I whispered before I turned to follow Chris, who was walking back. As we made our way to my house, I felt like I had seen or done something I wasn't meant to. I revisited the site in my nightmares that evening. In my dream, I was staring up at myself and Chris from within the pit. When Chris tossed the roach into the pit, I watched it fall in slow motion for what seemed like an eternity. When the embered tip finally went out, there was an inhuman cry that carved into my eardrums like a hot awl. My vision cannonballed out of the pit and swerved through the trees in the forest until it stopped just outside my bedroom window, where I saw myself sleeping. I immediately woke up and looked out of my bedroom window, my eyes searching wildly for something new or out of place. But there was nothing there. I sat there hyperventilating for several seconds before I started to calm down. The next day at school, I hurried over to Chris during our shared free period in the back of the library. "Hey man, how's it going?" He didn't respond. "Yo, you good?" I put my hand on his shoulder, and he jolted upright. "Shit, you scared the hell out of me," he said sleepily, rubbing his eyes. "Sorry, I was taking a nap. I didn't get much sleep last night." Did he have the same dream? I thought to myself. I didn't ask. I just wanted it to be a weird nightmare. I sat down across from him at the table and pulled my laptop out. "So, what's good?" I asked. "Not much, but listen to this. After I went home last night, I couldn't stop thinking about the hole. It was weird, right?" Chris answered. "Yeah, very," I replied. "So, I decided to do some Googling about really deep pits and came across this thing called Mel's Hole. Some guy called this paranormal radio show in the 90s and talked about this hole he found that was so deep that even an 80,000-foot fishing line didn't reach the bottom. The thing might be a hoax, but regardless, it got me thinking. How does the hole like the one we found exist? No idea, but there's something not right about it. And on a side note, can we stop calling it the hole? It's kind of bothering me referring to it like that. How about Heather's Hole? It's in your backyard, after all. That's gross. I laughed. Something else? How about the circle? It was a perfect circle, after all. That's better. So, should we go back and check it out later? Chris asked. Was he not afraid of that thing like I was? I dunno, Chris. The circle makes me really anxious. So what are we supposed to do? Forget about it? Chris said with a hint of frustration. I don't know what I want to do. But Chris cut me off. You had a dream too, didn't you? I stared into his eyes. They twitched. Why, yeah. The falling roach and then something coming out of the circle, right? Yeah, I saw it too. I sat in silence for a moment. You want to go back after that? We had the same dream, man. That means something. Nothing's happened. For all we know, we were just scared by it and had really similar dreams. Chris had a point. But what if something does happen? Chris scratched his cheek. We'll go from there. Fine, I muttered. Anyways, did you do the homework for Miss Kennedy's class? After school, I had a lot of homework that day and wasn't feeling very social, so I decided to just stay in for the night. While I was working on a short story for my American storytelling class, I heard my parents get in from work. I continued typing away when I heard footsteps ascending the staircase. They stopped just outside my bedroom door. What's up? I shouted. Silence. Mom. I waited for a response. Dad. Again. Silence. Chills slid down my spine as I remembered the dream from the night before. I sat frozen to my chair until a heavy knock on the door made me jump in my seat. I stared at the door for what felt like hours, paralyzed by fear. After a few minutes, I heard the front door open again, this time accompanied by the voices of my parents. I breathed a sigh of relief. I'm just imagining things, I told myself. I opened my bedroom door so I felt safer, knowing now that my parents were home. With a slight tremble, I resumed writing my short story. Later that night as I drifted off, The same dream I had had the night before played back to me. Once again, I woke up after seeing myself asleep in my bed, this time shivering and covered in sweat. I jumped out of bed and pulled my blinds shut. I looked at my alarm clock. 3:02 a.m. Suddenly, I heard slow, methodical footsteps ascending the staircase again. Moving quickly, I shoved the mini fridge in my room in front of the bedroom door and got back in bed, cowering underneath my covers as I stared at the doorknob. It slowly began to turn. Go away, go away, go away, go away, I pleaded under my breath. There was the sound of something running at the door and then bang, 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 bang. The door shook one last time. Then, silence. I stared at the door until I drifted back into uneasy sleep. The next morning, I was awoken by more heavy banging at my door. I jolted upright. "Heather, open this door," shouted my mom. I sighed in relief as I got out of my bed and moved the fridge away from the door. My mom instantly opened it. "Why was your door blocked?" I debated telling her the truth, but knew she wouldn't believe me. I was moving my furniture around last night and forgot to move the fridge back. "Sorry." My mom looked at me with exasperation. "Okay, but don't leave it front of your door. What if there was a fire?" "Sorry, Mom. Come downstairs for breakfast. Dad made waffles." When I got to school, I immediately met with Chris. "I think something followed us from the circle." "What are you talking about?" Chris replied. "So nothing happened to you last night?" "No, why?" "Something tried to get into my room." "How do you know?" "Just trust me, Chris. I'm serious about this." "Calm down. Just tell me what happened." I told Chris everything I'd experienced the previous night. "Christ, do you think it'll happen again tonight?" "I don't know. Probably. We have to do something. We don't even know what this thing is or what it wants. What can we do? Maybe there's some kind of offering we can make. I think the fire from the joint woke it up. So there must be something we can do to maybe calm it down? I don't know. That's what they do in horror movies. This is real life, though." "Well, do you have a better idea?" "No, I guess not. We should try throwing some meat and jewelry into the hole after school." "That's oddly specific. What else do demons want? Flowers and mixtapes?" I replied sarcastically. "All right, fine. We'll go with meat and jewelry. I'll bring what I can to your house around 5. "Sounds good." That afternoon, I watched as Chris walked up my driveway. "You ready?" I asked him. "Yeah. Are you? You don't look so good." Chris replied. "I don't really want to go back there, but I'd rather fix whatever is happening." The two of us followed the marked trees to the circle. "Eugeha," Chris exclaimed, holding his nose. "Smells like rotten eggs." "Did it smell like this last time?" I asked. I couldn't remember. Definitely not. I peered over the edge and felt an urge to jump. I stepped back. "All right, let's throw in our offerings." Chris threw some leftover meat he'd had in his fridge into the hole, and I threw in jewelry I didn't wear anymore. Some gold, some silver. Nothing happened. "Is that it?" Chris asked. "We won't know until tomorrow." I felt a sense of relief, as though a heavy weight had lifted from my shoulders. We went back to my place and played video games until Chris had to go home. I felt uneasy but hopeful as the night came. I hadn't heard anything out of place so far. When I went to bed, I laid there listening to the dark silence, fearing that it would not last. To my surprise, it did. I finally fell asleep and didn't wake up again until morning. The offering must have worked. When I got to school, I approached Chris during our shared period. "Hey man, I think we did it," I exclaimed. "I don't know about that," Chris replied absently. My gut sank. "What do you mean?" Once I got home last night, my whole house smelled like rotten eggs. I spent like an hour trying to find the source of the smell, but eventually I couldn't even smell it anymore. So I just went in my room and went on Reddit. As I was falling asleep, I heard glass shatter downstairs. I figured it was probably just my cat knocking over a glass or something, but when I got down there, the glass from the front door was broken all over on the living room floor. I couldn't see anyone outside, but I got this awful feeling that I should not go out there. Where were your parents? Date night, they didn't get back until after all this. Well, what happened next? Well, I didn't go outside. I called my parents and told them that someone threw a rock through the front door, and they said they'd deal with it when they got home. I just went to my room and looked at eye bleach and shy videos to try to calm myself, but I just couldn't shake the dread. Then there were these heavy footsteps running down the hallway outside my bedroom. My heart was racing. They'd reached the end of the hall, then run the opposite direction, until finally something heavy slammed into my door. I was freaking out at this point, especially when I realized I'd left my cell phone downstairs. Why didn't you call the cops when your door shattered? I don't know. I don't always think straight when I'm afraid. All right, sorry, just tell me the rest. Chris sighed. Anyways, I heard footsteps above me in the attic, too. Then something started tapping on my window, but I was too afraid to open the curtains. Eventually, I heard my parents' car coming up the driveway, and all the sounds suddenly stopped. It took me a few minutes to calm myself down, but I told my parents that I thought someone had broken in and might be hiding in the house. They called the cops, who came by and did a search. Did they find anything? No, but they said they'll station a car outside for a couple nights just to make sure no one comes back. Well, what should we do? Chris was silent for a minute. What if it wants something living? No, Chris, I won't do that, I said sternly. Do what? A sacrifice? Are you serious? Well, your jewels and meat didn't do anything. Chris was getting agitated. I understood his fear, but I didn't want to do something violent to appease this thing. Listen, man, I want to stop this as much as you do, but not like this. It doesn't have to be a dog or goat or something. We could just trap a squirrel or rabbit or something and throw it in. I sighed. If you trap them, then fine. Thank you. We'll make this stop. I really hope so, I said. On another note, did you do Ms. Chambers' essay? Oi. That night I dreamt again, but the nightmare had changed. I was dangling in the pit, clutching a vine. I was filled with dread as I peered into the darkness below. I tried to climb out, but the vine broke. As I fell deep into the abyss, windows started appearing in the dirt and stone that surrounded me. I could see my family, Chris, and windows that showed families and children in vintage clothing. The farther I fell, the more disturbing the images through the windows became. My eyes flooded with tears. I started to see people I knew from school silently weeping blood. I saw my parents lying motionless in the backyard. I saw Chris crying in his bed, his teeth stained with blood. My descent slowed until I landed in a bed, my own bed, with my bedroom forming from out of the darkness. There was a steady tapping at my window, and I slowly got out of bed despite my overwhelming anxiety. I felt like I was walking through water as I moved through my room. As I approached the window, I could see the outline of Chris standing in my yard. My window unlocked itself and gently opened, a cool breeze rolling through. Chris, I shouted. He began to laugh, the sound of a crowd of people, not one boy. He sank into the ground as the world around me began to shake. I woke up to find my bed shaking violently. I started screaming, and it suddenly stopped. My heart was racing, and I barely had time to catch my breath before I heard a light tapping on my window. I tried to ignore it, but the longer I did so, The heavier it became until I heard the glass crack. Then silence. I was not about to look out my window. I picked up my cell phone and dialed Chris's number. He picked up almost immediately. "Are you okay? What's up?" Chris said. "More stuff happened. We need to finish this tomorrow. Did the traps catch anything?" I said between heavy breaths. "I haven't checked yet. What happened?" I woke up from a nightmare to my bed shaking and something hitting my window. "Were you awake when I called?" "Yeah, some stuff happened here too." I went downstairs to get a glass of water, and all the windows and doors in the entire house were wide open. I tried to wake my parents up, but they're out really cold. "What about the cops? Wasn't there one stationed outside?" "They were asleep too. The cops really are useless. Is everything else okay?" "I've been hearing footsteps throughout the house. I've just been hiding in my room. I'll go to bed when the sun is up again." "I don't blame you. Just be safe. Will you stay on the phone with me?" "Yeah, sure. I can't sleep anyways." I stayed on the phone with Chris until sunlight poured through my windows. I could hear what sounded like distant whispers outside my window throughout the night, but they disappeared with the dark. The rest of the day went normally, and the two of us met up after school in my backyard. My parents were still at work as I waited outside my house smoking a bowl. After a couple minutes, Chris came around the corner holding two humane traps. One had a large rabbit in it, the other a restless raccoon. My heart sank thinking of what was going to happen to these innocent forest creatures. "Are you ready to end this?" Chris said to me. "More ready than you can imagine. I feel bad about the animals, though." Chris looked at the animals and frowned. "I'm not excited either, but it's the only thing that makes sense anymore. Come on, let's get to it." The two of us walked through the forest, following the marked trees to the circle. The land around us was silent. In the cages, the animals were going berserk, biting at the cage and making horrible sounds. I felt both emotional anguish and physical dread. As we approached the circle, Chris turned to me. "Does it look bigger than before to you?" I looked at it. I wasn't sure, but it definitely seemed larger. "Yeah, it kinda does look bigger." "All right, do you want to throw them in?" Chris asked me, lifting up the cages. "I really don't. I'll cry if I do it." "Okay, I'll do it." Chris walked over to the edge of the circle and peered inside, taking a deep breath. "Okay." I watched as Chris threw the panicking animals into the abyss, the sounds of their whimpers and cries going silent as the circle swallowed them. Tears welled up in my eyes, and I wiped my face with the back of my sleeve. "Is that it? Can we go now?" "Let's hope this works." "Yeah, let's go back and smoke a bowl. I need to relax right now." As night fell, we parted ways. The events of the last few days, ever since we had stumbled across the circle, had been weirder and more stressful than anything I had experienced before. I just hoped this would be the end of things. Since it was Friday night, I stayed up really late. I was still anxious to sleep. By 1 a.m., my parents had gone to bed and nothing had happened yet. I was beginning to feel like things had worked. I checked my phone. There were no notifications from Chris. I decided to call him, just to check up on him. All I got was his voicemail. "He's just asleep," I thought. I continued to play video games until I heard shouting outside my window. I recognized Chris' voice. I immediately ran to my window and opened it. There he was, standing in the moonlit backyard, still in pajamas and shaking. "Dude, what are you doing here? Did something happen?" I whisper yelled. We have to go to the circle. Now, things have gotten worse." Chris huffed. "What are you talking about? What happened?"
Ugh.
Chris sighed angrily and started walking towards the forest without a flashlight. I said to myself as I put on a pair of pants and grabbed a flashlight. I also grabbed a knife, just in case. I went downstairs, careful not to wake my parents, and went to the back door. Chris was gone. I was scared, but I wasn't about to let my best friend go to the circle alone. It occurred to me that this might be a trick, an inhuman force appearing as Chris. This was a common twist in horror stories. Even so, I wasn't going to risk leaving Chris alone in the woods without a flashlight. I opened the door, took a deep breath, and started towards the tree line. There was a stagnant mist hanging in the forest as I followed the marked trees, calling out Chris's name. I gripped the knife tight in my left hand as I carefully made my way through the woods. Eventually I came to the circle, and it was wider than before. It even seemed to be growing before my eyes. There was a loud groan as a tree at the edge lost its grip on the earth and tumbled in, disappearing silently into the abyss. "Heather," I heard Chris say behind me. "Chris," I shouted as I turned around. He was standing with a slouch just a couple feet away from me. "What happened, man? Why are we here?" "I don't know. I don't know, but it's worse now. It's worse, Heather." Chris calmed down, talk to me. "No," Chris shouted. He pushed me and I fell down. I looked behind me. The hole was coming closer. It was hungry. "Chris, what the hell?" I shouted as I stood up. He grunted and lunged at me. I dodged him and he stumbled, nearly falling into the expanding abyss. "I have to, Heather. It's the only way." He lunged at me again and successfully knocked me against a tree, my head colliding with the bark. I dropped everything in my hands as I hit the tree. He shoved me harder against the bark as I tried to punch and push him away, but he wasn't budging. "I'm sorry, Chris," I shouted as I brought my left leg up between his knees. He instantly keeled over as I grabbed the knife from beside the tree. "Please calm down and tell me what happened," I said, panting. "I don't want to have to defend myself again." Chris moaned in pain and looked up at me before trying to lunge at me again. I sidestepped him and slashed clumsily with the knife. I think it tore his shirt, but everything was happening so fast. I quickly moved away so that I wasn't facing the growing hole behind me and held up the knife. "Chris, please. Stop this," Chris cried out and came at me again. I swung the knife frantically as he approached me, landing one swipe on his torso. He put his hand to his chest, feeling the warm blood seep between his fingers. He looked at me with a look of anger I had never seen before. I was afraid before this, but now I truly feared for my life. "Please, Chris, I'm not playing." I tried to step back, but he lunged at me again. I raised the knife and stabbed at him, aiming for somewhere that wouldn't kill him. He grunted as the blade of my knife sank into his right shoulder. He took a step backward and looked me in my eyes. "Heather." He stumbled back once more and caught his foot on a stone by the edge of the circle. "Chris, no." I sprang forward and tried to grab at him as he fell backwards, but I was too late. I watched in terror as he disappeared into the abyss, screaming as he fell. The ground quaked as the hole stopped growing. I collapsed to the ground and cried there for several minutes, the fear replaced with anguish. "Chris, no." I choked. I had killed my best friend. Even though it was in self-defense, I could not help but blame myself for what had happened. I wanted to wake up, but this wasn't a dream. It was a living nightmare. Too distraught to comprehend what had just occurred, I grabbed my flashlight and stumbled back home through the mist. I woke my parents up as soon as I got home and told them everything. They were skeptical, but my dad agreed to follow me out to the woods after seeing how shaken I really was. The mist was gone, and I lead him along the marked trees until we reached the end. He sighed. "Heather, there's nothing here. It was just a dream." My dad sighed. I stared in absolute disbelief at the solid ground before me. This was where the circle had been. I could see the rock that Chris had tripped on, the disturbed soil where a tree had fallen into nothingness. I propped myself against a tree, overcome with nausea. "Honey, are you okay?" my dad asked, putting a hand on my shoulder. It must have been a dream after all," I said. I didn't believe it. Everything I had just experienced seemed so real. The circle, the knife, the blood, Chris' screams, all seared into my brain. But I didn't want to try to rationalize it right then. We returned home and I went to bed, although I never went to sleep. I kept trying to call Chris throughout the night and the following days, but he never answered. Neither would his parents when I called his house. I knocked on their door, but no one seemed to be home. The following Monday, Chris didn't show up to school. Same with Tuesday and Wednesday. The police searched his house and found both of his parents dead in some sort of bloodbath. The cops theorized that Chris had murdered his parents and ran away to avoid arrest. But I knew the truth. Chris was dead. I was the only one who knew what had really happened to him, but what could I say? People would just think I was crazy, or that I was trying to cover for my friend. The circle was gone. So was my best friend. But the memories would never fade, nor the constant struggle to come to terms with what had happened and why. You can be assured of one thing, though. I haven't spent a day in the woods since.